My name's Mike Frazier, and I'm here as one of the officers of the Rhinebeck Historical Society, and I'm going to be talking today about the history of this church, St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church. This is part of a multi-year program. Each year for the past 4 or 5 years, we've tried to have at least one of our, we do about 10 programs a year, many of them in the lower level of the Star Library, but we also try to do one program each year that features one of the churches here in the community. We've done the Reformed Church, the United Methodist Church in the village, we haven't done the Baptist church yet, partly because we're trying to decide whether to do it where the Baptist church is today or where the Baptist church used to be at the Terrapin, and I think Stephen Mann is going to be doing that program. And we've done the Episcopal Church, the newer Episcopal Church, not the one where they started out, which I'll be talking about briefly today. The focus today, though, is on St. Joseph's Catholic Church. And what I'd like to begin with is a question. Why did it get called St. Joseph's? Who was St. Joseph? St. Joseph was the husband of the Blessed Virgin, the father of Jesus. But he was also St. Joseph the worker. And what you see here is he was a carpenter by trade, a craftsman, described in several of the books of the Bible that way. And it wasn't like St. Michael. This isn't called St. Michael's Church. St. Michael was battling evil archangels, or like Peter or Paul, preaching to those, and wasn't somebody with the gift to do that. He was somebody who had his nose to the grindstone and took his responsibilities seriously, and was also responsible for this is a painting, by the way, from the 1640s. It's a French painting, and it shows him as a worker. And by coincidence, behind me here on the altar to my right is how St. Joseph is often depicted, as holding the tools of a carpenter. He's got a chisel and a right angle in his right hand and a hammer in his left hand. And why would the church here be named after St. Joseph? Think about that question as we move on here. The situation in Europe, specifically in Ireland, in the 1840s was pretty dismal. And there was an enormous amount of emigration from the country, not just to the United States, but to Canada, to Argentina, even to England, but much of it here. And it wasn't just because of the famine that had occurred, the potato blight that had occurred in the late 1830s. There had been the English penal laws that had been passed in 1801. Ireland had been united with England, and the conflicts between renters and landlords in Ireland had gotten quite bitter. There were quite a few problems in that area, and the decrease in civil rights that were accorded to people in the renter class in Ireland became it just got to the point where many felt it was intolerable, and while the famine is often thought of as the primary reason, it really was more the icing on the cake. Whatever the reason, many left and many came here. What did they find here? Well, this is it's actually a little hard to tell from this slide, but this is a campaign button for Millard Fillmore and Andrew Jackson Donaldson. It's the campaign for president and vice president in 1856. Millard Fillmore had been president before and had been persuaded by the Know Nothing Party to run. They were also described as nativists. Native Americans was what they called themselves. We now use that term to mean those who had lived here before any white man ever got to these shores. But in the 1850s, that meant a very specific political group. And that political group was harshly pro-Protestant, harshly anti-Catholic. They were concerned about jobs. They saw Catholic immigration into this country, potentially seizing jobs from those who had lived here for generations. And while this party didn't win this particular election, it was Buchanan who was elected in the 1856 election. Nonetheless, they got 23% of the electoral votes that particular year, and that's pretty significant. They were behind the Democrats and the Whigs. However, particularly in New York City, in the mayoral elections, where a great number of Irish lived, they were a major factor to contend with. And it was an area of surprise and concern for those who had come to this country expecting that the kind of discrimination that they were experiencing in Europe wasn't going to repeat itself. On the contrary, it seemed like a repetition of what they had seen at home. When you're in a situation like that, you need a defender. And John Hughes filled that bill, and he filled it quite well. He was initially, he came from Ireland himself, actually had wanted to go to, had emigrated with his family here to the United States, and tried to get education at a higher education, college level, but couldn't manage that. But he did manage to, he worked as a gardener, as a laborer, and was appointed Bishop of New York, had become a priest and was appointed Bishop of New York in 1842. It wouldn't be until 21 years later, 1863, that he would come here to Rhinecliff to dedicate this particular church. And that was a year before he would die, less than a year after his dedication of this church. But he campaigned very actively on behalf of Irish immigrants. He tried to get one of his, he was a very firm believer that Catholics had to be educated in parochial schools. One of his concerns was that if you went to any public schools on the East Coast, in Philadelphia, New York, you were expected to use the King James Bible, and that was not the Reams Bible. And he actually, the irony is that while that never became, while he encouraged the creation of Catholic schools, and many families sent their children there who were in the New York area in his archdiocese, it wasn't until 20 years after his death in 1884 that that in Baltimore a decision was made that required each diocese to have its own Catholic school, and that expected families to send their children to those schools. But I'm jumping ahead of ourselves here. The important point with regard to John Hughes is that he was a firm defender of the Irish immigrants at a time when it was very difficult to be Irish in New York. However, you had anti-Catholic riots, for example, in Philadelphia. And he worked, 2 churches had been burned there. Some dozen people had died in those riots. And he wound up putting armed guards at the Catholic churches in New York, and famously told the mayor that if a single Catholic church in New York were burned, the city would become a second Moscow. And that was a reference to the Napoleon's scorched earth policy when he was in Russia. But the reason I raised that is that city leaders in New York took him at his word, and the anti-Catholic faction was not permitted to conduct the rally. And from that point forward, you had an increasing amount of sensitivity on the part of the New York political hierarchy to the immigrant groups, not just the Irish, but there were a good number of Germans in the New York City area. And Hughes was not a shy person. He was a very strong advocate of the religion that he was a defender of. He delivered an address in 1850 that he titled "The Decline of Protestantism and Its Causes," in which he announced as the ambition of Roman Catholicism to convert all pagan nations and all Protestant nations. Our mission is to convert the world, including the inhabitants of the United States, the people of the cities, the people of the country, the legislatures, the Senate, the cabinet, the president, and all. That was a bit much for some people to take, and later theologians and actually historians and people like Dorothy Day, who lived just north of here at the Catholic Worker Farm in Tivoli, said that that it was a period when, yes, it was understandable that there had to be that kind of aggressive defense of people who were suffering discrimination, but that some took it a bit too far, and as a result, some of the reaction lasted longer than it might otherwise have reacted. But let's come back to here in the Rhinebeck area. And somebody by the name of Michael Scully had grown up in Ireland. He had, at that time in Ireland in the 1830s, the 1840s, there were no seminaries. If you wanted to become a priest, you had to leave the country, and in his particular case, he went to Paris. There was what was referred to as an Irish college in Paris, where he was trained as a priest. And his first assignment was here in the United States. And he winds up being appointed by Archbishop Hughes to come up here to Northern Dutchess County. There's no church up here in Northern. There is a church in Poughkeepsie. There's St. Mary's across the river in the Rondout area in Kingston. And at that time, if you were Catholic in this area, and there were Catholics in this area, some had come down from Canada years ago, and there were others, the majority who were Catholic in this area were here because they had been working on the railroad, living in New York City, because that's where they had come when they'd gotten off the boat, some with families. But this was, the railroad got as far as Rhinecliff in 1851, and parcels were available to be sold here. Price was fairly reasonable, and an increasing number of Irish immigrants, and there were some Germans, there were some from other nationalities settled here. But if you're a Catholic, you're expected to go to church once a week. And what that meant was that you took the ferry over to Rondout, or there were a couple of Dominican priests in Hyde Park. You could go down there and Mass would be said there, or there was Mass said by a traveling priest in individual homes in this area. But it was increasingly obvious that there was a need for a church. Initially, when Father Scully came up here in around 1861, 1862, he said Mass at the Star Institute in Rhinebeck. And there are notices in the Rhinebeck Gazette from that period, not only about other kinds of gatherings that were hosted by Reverend Michael Scully at the Star Institute. Talks that he gave on the subject of St. Patrick, for example, is one of the lectures that, and they apparently were well attended and quite popular, not just with Catholics, but also non-Catholics. And so eventually he sees that, as I said, there's a need for actually a church here. And choice number one was to build a church at 45 Livingston Street. The money was gotten together and a parcel was actually purchased there. This house wasn't there at the time. This house didn't get built till 1866. But the difficulty he ran into is you had Catholics living in the village of Rhinebeck, but you also had more Catholics who apparently were more vehement or persuasive, or I'm not sure how they pulled it off, but they persuaded Father Scully to sell this parcel on Livingston Street and to build and to find a parcel first at choice number two. And he was the Catholics here were there was a benefactor by the name of George Rogers who lived in Tivoli, and George Rogers bought a 6-acre parcel where we are right now. It was then, and it remains today, to my knowledge, unless somebody's pulled together some fairly large parcels, the largest single parcel here in the hamlet of Rhinecliff. And he bought it from Charles Russell. Charles Russell ran a bank in New York City and was one of the directors of the Hudson River Railroad. And it was Charles Russell who held title to you really can't see it unless I would really enlarge this map. But this is an 1867 map that's from Beer's Atlas of the hamlet of Rhinecliff. And it's cut up into 100 and some parcels. The church has already bought the area that's in blue there. There are actually two other tiny churches, the Methodist Episcopal Church, that today is a private home, and the Episcopal Church in the lower left-hand corner there, a tiny blue parcel that also is privately owned today. But Charles Russell was selling these parcels, and the church, Michael Scully hired a fellow by the name of George Veitch, V-E-I-T-C-H, to design a church. Veitch, by the way, was the same person who had put in all the dotted lines and did the proposed layout of Rhinecliff for Charles Russell. Veitch had been brought up here by Elizabeth Skirmhorn Jones, who was the owner of the estate that would later be known as Wincliffe on the river, that unfortunately today is in pretty horrible condition. But at that time, Mrs. Jones was over the top in terms of how fancy she wanted everything to be, and was only hiring the most expensive and most capable people to do work for her, and trying to keep up with her generated the phrase keeping up with the Joneses. Eventually she would wind up having to sell out, so she wasn't able to keep up with herself. But the point is that George Veitch came to town, and he was responsible not only, by the way, the Episcopal Church, today's Good Shepherd, was designed by him. Veitch lived on Carroll Street, right here in Rhinecliff. As I said, he was the person who designed the church. John Bird was the name of the person who actually directed the workers here. Fairly simple, straightforward construction, and it was, the other reason that Veitch was a native of Ireland himself, and from that point of view had some sensitivity to the congregation that he knew was going to be using the church. And one of the things to be aware of is that even though with Archbishop Hughes there was an attitude of separatism and the need to be independent of the community in which you were located, under Father Scully, the attitude was quite different, and actually under Father Fitzsimmons, who followed him, there were, for example, soon after the church's opening, we find a story in the Gazette about a great picnic at which the Esopus String Band and the Butts Band from Poughkeepsie are playing, and there's an ad in the newspaper that says it's going to be a non-sectarian affair and the public is welcome to attend, and apparently a good number of them did. When Rhinecliff founded its own fire company, and I'm skipping ahead quite a few years here, this is 1915, there was, actually one of the reasons they founded their own fire company here was that certain kinds of equipment, the Rhinebeck Fire Department, Kip Hose Company #1, was a little reluctant to share, and the folks in Rhinecliff felt they needed more protection of their own. But fire equipment, even then, was not cheap, and they needed to do some serious fundraising for carts, for hoses, for ladders, uniforms. The one event was a large dinner at the Morton Library here that raised $200 for uniforms, and St. Joseph's was a part of that. They hosted a large dinner dance for that fundraiser. There was a separate school, but it didn't last very long. It was at the, I don't know if we can, it's indicated in that map, but it was on the northeast corner of Corning and Orchard Streets, and it's listed as under the supervision of Cornelius Scully. Presumably, we're not sure, that was a brother, or certainly probably a relative of Father Scully, but it was a boarding school rather than a school for those living here in Rhinecliff. And exactly when it stopped being in operation, I haven't been able to find any records to that effect, but it doesn't seem to have lasted very long. Things were moving in terms of numbers of members of the congregation here. It grew rather rapidly, not only here, but there was a need for, there was similar growth, partly because of the railroad expanding, partly because of just the climate economically was healthy despite a recession that happened in the 1870s. And you found churches beginning, getting set up in Tivoli. You had St. Sylvia's. You had Sacred Heart Church in Barrytown, Regina Caeli in Hyde Park, St. Paul in Statsburg, St. John or Joseph, I'm not sure which, in Clinton. And all of these were under the supervision of the pastor here in Rhinecliff at St. Joseph's Church. And that was a pretty heavy responsibility. Eventually, by very early 1900s, I understand, 1901, 1903, an additional church called a mission church was Good Shepherd in Rhinebeck. The Episcopal congregation had enough money to build a new church, the one that the Church of the Messiah today, and they were at the same time that this congregation was expanding, and when there were individuals in Rhinebeck who were looking for a church, you had it worked out that the former Episcopal church was available and the price appeared to be right. It was a little tricky. I understand the way this worked is that when it looked like the price was going to be fairly reasonable, a few $1,000s. In 1903, that was a lot of money. But when the trustees of the Episcopal Church found out that the Catholic Church was interested, all of a sudden the price jumped to $10,000. Well, at that juncture, the way I understand it, one of the members of that church was John Jacob Astor, and he said, wait a minute, fellow trustees, you got a bit of a problem here. If you're going to do this, my understanding, let me talk to the church here, to the Catholic Church, and ask what they have available. They said it would be, I think it was Father James Lennon at the time, the priest who's memorialized in the stained glass window above the altar. He said, we've got a little over $4,000 and that's it. That's all we can afford. John Jacob Astor went back to the other trustees of the Episcopal Church and said, look, you can charge them $10,000, but you can take the difference between $4,000 and $10,000 out of the contributions that I was planning on giving you. So the price was $4,000, a little over $4,000. And at that point, the Catholic Church then had a site in Rhinebeck. Today, I'm not going to tell a story here of Good Shepherd Church. That's for another lecture at another time. But the point is that this church was the mother church of all those churches, and what we see here is a print that was engraving that was done at the time when, again, the writing is too small for anybody to read it from where you're sitting in the pews, but it says at the bottom, St. Joseph's Church and Parsonage, and church is appended by Reverend James F. Fitzsimmons, and Father Fitzsimmons would have been the pastor here in the first half of the 1880s, and what we see up there in the upper left-hand corner is Regina Caeli, and the upper right-hand is St. Let's see. That's the Statsburg Church, Barrytown's Church of the Sacred Heart, in the lower right-hand corner, and St. Sylvia's in Tivoli in the lower left-hand corner. And Regina Caeli has rebuilt in the 1960s the church that's there today. St. Sylvia has made some modifications, but they're still a very active congregation in the center of Tivoli. Sacred Heart in Barrytown is a private home, but it had operated for quite a few years, and there is still a cemetery. This is on the road to the old railroad station called Station Hill Road in Barrytown, and the river is to my left, and as you head down towards the river is the cemetery affiliated with that church. George Rogers, by the way, is buried in that cemetery. The George Rogers who had arranged for the funds to buy the land that this church is on from Charles Russell. So so this church had played a very important role, and now the tables are turned, and this is a mission church of the Church of the Good Shepherd, the opposite of what the situation had been until certainly between the 1860s and the turn of the century. This is a photo of what is upstairs behind you in the choir loft. Is an organ that had been donated by Helen Morton. By the way, the Morton family also donated the organ that's in the Church of the Messiah in Rhinebeck. I've never heard it played, but I understand from members of the congregation that it still works just fine. It wasn't just the organ that Helen Morton donated to support this congregation. She lived at Ellerslie, was a daughter of the vice president, had lived alone there on that property until she passed away in 1952. Her father had died in 1920. She also traveled and had a place in New York City, but spent a lot of time here and was a faithful member of the congregation for many years. I understand that in her later years, a priest would go actually out to the house in which she lived on the property. The mansion had burned down in 1949 and had become a military academy, but she lived in a house that was called the Marathi House on the football field off the edge of that property until she passed away, and Mass would be said for her there. The other role that she played an important role once Good Shepherd was established and the land that was needed and the structure that was needed for a rectory there. is there through the good graces of largely Helen Morton. There had been the parish priest here lived right next door to here in a fairly sizable house, and I understand that the rationale for it being such a large structure, it was later sold and I think still belongs today to Miss Pattyfoot, but that priests would come up from New York City and spend time there. It was a spot to, if you actually had a day or two, to have some leisure up in the country, and it was a welcoming place. But it eventually was, it was larger than what was needed. It required quite a bit of maintenance, and there was also the congregation in Rhinebeck. This congregation became smaller. In the late 1800s, many of the members of this congregation had moved away. Many had moved west. And while there remain today, and there have been times, I know Father Brogan spent a good amount of time persuading the Archdiocese for the support that was necessary to continue to operate this as a very active church. And I was here for Mass about 2 months ago, and there were quite a few people here for that Mass. It's still a very lively church, and the Father Kim, who's sitting there on the side aisle there, can tell you that having the responsibility of 2 churches and a sizable congregation is pretty heavy duty. One of the issues that Archbishop Hughes faced in the 1840s and 50s and 60s was he had a much larger congregation than he ever had priests available to serve. And that's unfortunately still a challenge today for just about every archdiocese. Let me talk a bit about what we're going to see in the cemetery in a moment. One of the things to note on a lot of the stones is that those who were buried here, their families were very proud of the fact that they had come here from Ireland. They hadn't forgotten their home. And they came from all over, and it's often memorialized on the tombstones. This is a Mary Monaghan who had come from County, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Cavan?
No, Cavan.
Cavan, see? Okay. County Patrick Clabby, who came from County Longford. John Butler from Kilkenny. And here's Francis Rooney from County Leitrim. Thank you. Probably the most important single tombstone out there is that of Father Scully. When we go out the front of the church, we'll make a left, and that will be one of the stones that we see there. Unfortunately, over the years, a lot of the writing has been effaced by the wind and the rain. The other really important tombstone, and many of you very likely remember him, is that of Monsignor Joy. Monsignor Joy had been responsible for this congregation for many years, was preparing for midnight Mass on one year, and became ill and died that evening. He's buried right in the front of the church. I'm going to shift for a moment, and you're going to wonder why on earth would we have Colonel Douglas MacArthur did not come from Rhinebeck, nor is he buried here, but there is a connection here. This is him at the Was Ain Cemetery in France. It's 1930, and these are memorial tombstones for veterans, for soldiers who were killed in France during World War I. There are 6,000 in this single cemetery. One of them is the person who was standing next to Douglas MacArthur when he was with the 42nd Division in 1918. His name was Joyce Kilmer. Joyce was one of the sergeants at the time that MacArthur was a major, I believe, at the time, chief of staff for that particular division. And Joyce Kilmer received the French Croix de Guerre. It's their highest honor. It's comparable to our Medal of Honor for his service. In this cemetery, however, there's also someone else buried who's from Rhinecliff. And it's the only soldier from the town of Rhinebeck who served in World War I, and there were many who didn't come back. I took this picture a week ago. I was in France, and I had spoken with Alan Kuhn. I was going there for other reasons, and wanted to visit this grave. And the family had never had a chance to be there. What the head of the cemetery gave me to present to the family is a flag that is in memory of Edward Fitzpatrick. Bob here, who's in the last row here in the church, came at my invitation, and what I want to do is to present this to the family on behalf of the French government and the U.S. government, who presented them to me at the cemetery. So Bob, on behalf of those who, I believe he's your great uncle?
I'm going to do a little more research, but yes, it is possible.
Edward Fitzpatrick is memorialized in the cemetery here. There is a stone where a good number of the other members of the Fitzpatrick family, including his two parents, are buried. And at the bottom of that stone is, I think I have it next to me. It's a little difficult to read, but it says here, our dear son, Edward A. Fitzpatrick, born September 10, 1889, killed in France. AEF is the American Expeditionary Force. September 10, 1918, he was killed on his birthday. And may his soul rest in peace. So, it was, he is treated with a great deal of respect.
Thank you so much for doing that. Thank you.
we have other veterans who are buried in that cemetery as well. There's a veteran of the Civil War, John Reinders, buried in the cemetery. And other veterans of World War I, Joseph Ross, for example, and quite a few veterans of more recent years. I haven't made any comparison. I spent quite a bit of time with Nancy Kelly and Alan Kuhn recently doing some research of veterans of the Civil War, and I haven't made any comparisons of how many from one congregation or another congregation or how many in whatever cemeteries. But it's clear just looking out from the back of the church and seeing the plaques that indicate that it's a veteran who's buried here. The numbers are quite significant. This congregation was there when there was a need for service. And it's not, coming back to the initial theme of why St. Joseph. He was the worker. He had his nose to the grindstone. He did what had to be done. Sometimes he had questions. Sometimes he didn't know why things needed to be done a particular way. What is this virgin birth stuff? But he had a child that he was responsible for and raised that child. And I think that seems to me to be the story of this congregation, and that's why that saint was such an appropriate saint to use as a model for the church. I want to thank a few people. Bill McGann was very helpful to me in providing me with a variety of material and access to the church here several times. Bob Donaldson, former history teacher in Rhinebeck, had helped me out in researching some of the people that are buried here in the cemetery. Bob Haywood, Haywood family's been here in Rhinecliff for a good while, and Bob shared some material with me that was very helpful. He's guidance counselor, as many of you know, at Rhinebeck High School. Geraldine Brown, who's here today, had sent me some material that was very useful. Thank you, Geraldine. And Father Ken had made it possible for me to be able to speak here today. One of the awkward things, quite frankly, for a parish priest is that if something is going to happen in a church that isn't a religious service, the Blessed Sacrament has to be removed from the church because this isn't a service. And Father had to come here to take care of that, and I appreciate that. But more significantly, he keeps the congregation together, and he keeps the place spiritually in the kind of condition that it needs to be in, and that's quite a challenge. And Father Brogan, who hasn't been here for some years now, but who had pulled together and worked with, I think it was, her name was Natalie Carnese, who had done an earlier history of this church that I found very helpful. So with that, we're going to go outside and be glad to try to answer any questions. Before we do that, I'll take one or two. Anybody with any questions? Everybody's eager to go outside. Yes, ma'am.
Did you say, and maybe I didn't hear, what happened to the priest's residence that was connected to this church?
The priest's residence is now a group home, as I understand it, for the developmentally disabled, and has been for some years now. It's a magnificent structure right next door here, and there are associated structures as well. Yes.
How large a population came to this church when there was this? Seems to be a very large church for.
I don't know what the size of the congregation was. I don't have those numbers.
Because like Regina Celli, there was a smaller church before they built a big church, and I wondered, but this didn't happen here.
My understanding is that the footprint today is what was here originally. I don't know, Father Kim, do you know any difference?
Yeah, this is the original.
Yes.
What were the stained glass windows put in?
I don't know. These are, my understanding is that these may be Tiffany, or at least by somebody who had worked with Tiffany. In fact, you know, before we go outside, you should take a moment and take a closer look at them. We, you know, up here in the front on the right, we have the Blessed Mother in memory of William Howard. We have I'm not sure which saint this is supposed to be, who's holding the book in her left hand.
St. Anne, I think.
St. Anne, in memory of gift of Mrs. O'Neill. The church, the third one there, is in memory of by Mr. and Mrs. James Bryce, and believe that's St. Bridget the Shepherdess.
I think it's St. Agnes.
St. Agnes? Okay. And then, let's see here. Fourth one is possibly St. Teresa. Am I batting zero at this point?
I would say it's St. Teresa of Avila.
Okay.
And I don't know why she's here, because the Irish had not a particular lot of devotion to her, but so it might be St. Bridget.
Yeah, I've been curious as to, you know, the names of the individuals are not, I mean, I've looked at the dates of death of some of the individuals that these are in memory of, and it's not 1863. These were put in, I don't know, it's hard to tell. I just don't have the documentation. I don't believe they were originally here. They very likely were quite costly, and the congregation had to spend some time raising the money to be able to purchase those. But I haven't seen any records that indicate when that might have occurred. My guess in the dates of death of many of the individuals is that we're looking at the early 1900s, somewhere in that ballpark. And then over on this side as well, there's a magnificent window of St. Joseph holding the baby Jesus, which I guess most of you can't see because the screen is blocking it. Can you see it? Okay, and that's the gift of the person who had been the parish priest here at the turn of the century in 1901. And then on my right is Jesus, who's the gift of Mr. and Mrs. James Kearns. And then we have here, with the keys in his left hand, would be St. Peter, is my guess. In memory of George and Joanna Rogers, and George Rogers from Tivoli, I believe, who was responsible for the donation of the land here. And it's from their daughter, Mary Kate. And then going further back, dressed in green with a long beard, would be St. Patrick. And that's in memory of James Leary. And finally, way in the back is you see, that's Cornelius Sullivan, and that's St. Michael, who's engaged in a fight with the evil archangels. And there's even some window way in the back behind the statues, and a more contemporary window above the choir loft, and windows in even the bathroom, if you have occasion to use that. So it's really, the windows, Carol, are really magnificent, and they're a treasure. And we're fortunate to be able to be in here and to have a look at them. Any other questions before we head outside? Okay, why don't we do that? Hadn't been here as a pastor even, I think it'd been about 8 years when he passed away, and was a very vigorous parish priest, and to have to pull a congregation together like that, start a new church, to have these requests to set up churches in other locations was really quite a challenge. And he was a native of Ireland. We have, I had those photos of tombstones, and you'll see them scattered about, that mention that Ireland was the place of birth. If we, you can kind of tell by the nature of the stone and how much it's worn, where the older burials are. The area closer to the street was used later, apparently because folks decided that was needed to be used. The area over here where the Bryce family is located, and you see a fairly sizable cross over here. And you also see initials on a couple of stones here that are all that are Bryce family stones, and they are one of the families that donated one of the stained glass windows inside the church. If we, let's see, we're going to move over to the other side of the church for a moment and take a look at Monsignor Joy's stone. Monsignor Joy served as the pastor of the church for 25 years and was very well respected and loved by everybody that he had dealings with, and was, as I had mentioned earlier, preparing to come for midnight mass when he died. And
What year was that, please? 1985.
1985, December 25th. He had, he was 83 years old, so it's not like the story of Father Scully, who lived half that long. But they were both, they are the only two pastors who are buried here at the church. Others were, after their service here, were assigned elsewhere, and I'm not, I don't know where I haven't tried to figure out where they are buried. I was a little confused at one point because we had a James Lennon and a Michael Lennon, both of whom were pastors here, but James Lennon was around the turn of the century, 90-something to 1903 perhaps. And Michael Lennon was some 15, 20 years later, and I don't know. Maybe they were related. I have no idea. But Lennon is a fairly common name. Now, what I one of the things that you do see from the number of flags that are here is that there are a substantial number of veterans that are buried here in the cemetery, and you see that even more so as you look over the far side of the hill. Now I'm trying to, is Bob Fitzpatrick here? I think the Fitzpatrick, the stone is down in this direction. So Edward Fitzpatrick is not buried here, but he is memorialized here on the stone. And I realize the angle of the sun is such that you're looking almost right into it, and it's all in shadow and it's hard to read. This is how he was remembered by his parents, who lived some 6-10 years past the date of their son's death, and I was glad to be able to be in a position where it wasn't that difficult for me to stop at that cemetery. But there are thousands who are buried in that cemetery, and one of the other places I stopped when I was in France was at Omaha Beach, and there are there as well many thousands of American servicemen buried. And I mean, my own father fought in World War II. He fortunately was not wounded and able to come home after the war without any physical scars, at least. But in this cemetery, as in many cemeteries, not just in Rhinebeck, but throughout the country, we see that there are many who serve, and not all are able to return. But it's important that we honor those who did all they could and who gave their all, as Edward did. Time has really moved on here more than I had anticipated. I am glad to try to answer questions. I'd like to just make a pit stop by a couple of other graves. One, a Civil War veteran that's downhill a bit. And actually further along the other side, one of a physician here in Rhinebeck who died fairly recently is buried there. Don McKibben, who I have a feeling a good number of you knew. And I think rather than trying to call attention to any individual person, it's more in keeping with the spirit of a cemetery that focuses on somebody who's simply doing a job. That we not pick out one rather than another who's more important than another. So I leave it at that. So I'm going to take a trek downhill here for a bit. You really have to be on the other side to see the stone. This is John Reinders of Company H, 150th Regiment, New York Volunteers. You know, he lived to the healthy old age of 52 and died in 1896. And there are a couple of other Civil War veterans, from what I understand, who are buried in this cemetery, but I haven't been able to track them down. Yeah, here's one, John Scanlon, Kate Talon, you know, who was, if you go down below, it mentions was born, I'm not sure what county, in Ireland. What is the county?
M-E-A-T-H.
Meath? Where's our Irish pronouncer here? We lost her. But
It actually gives the parish too.
I think I haven't seen it, it sounds right.
Parish Navan, County Meath, Ireland.
yeah. We do have, I did find a couple. I did find somebody over in the far corner over there, and they mentioned it on their stone that they were born in London. And there is another one who was born in Scotland. But those were the only exceptions that I found. Actually, there were quite a few when the Irish were leaving Ireland. Many of them did go to Scotland. Actually, yeah. Now, what I'm looking for, is a World War I veteran by the name of Joseph Ross. And my recollection is that maybe this is it right up here where the flag is. Yeah, here he is. Here's Joseph Roth from the private with 105th Field Artillery, 27th Division. You know, he would have been born in 1899, so if he was serving in 1917, he was only 17 or 18. But he lived well past the war, died in 1948.